Good afternoon. This is Ken Gosnell with CEO Experience, and today at our CEO Conversation, I'm delighted to welcome the author of the book, Great Leaders Ask Great Questions, and a newly released book entitled, Now That's a Great Question. And we know that questions are an essential part of good leadership. Asking the right questions can often lead us to the right answers. So today I'm delighted to welcome the author of those books and a personal friend. Hey, Bob, thank you for being here with us today. I'm delighted to host you.
Ken, it's my privilege. Been looking forward to this.
Well, Bob, I love your books. I love what you teach from a leadership perspective, and I'm delighted about your new book. Now, that's a great question. And what's intriguing about that book is you start that book off with a confession. Can you talk a little bit about what you confessed and tell us a little bit about that book?
Yes. They say that confession is good for the soul, but bad for the reputation. So I will chance it. Some people, because they've seen my books, think that leading with questions must come naturally to me. And I share, well, that's not the case. Telling comes naturally to me. I'm in the first book, I shared that I'm a charter member of TA. And most people don't know what TA stands for. Well, there's Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, TA is Tellers Anonymous. We go to our meetings and they say, hello, Bob. And I stand up and say, hello, I'm Bob. I'm a teller. And that's what comes naturally. And I've discovered there's a lot of other charter members of Tellers Anonymous.
Absolutely. Yep.
But my confession is that for most of my career, I was what I would call a benevolent dictator. The only paradigm of leadership that I was aware of was to tell. Now, the benevolent part was to use please and thank you and to express appreciation for work well done, individually as well as publicly. But at its heart, I thought the job of a leader was to kindly tell staff, direct them, tell them what to do. And it wasn't until 2006 when I discovered the book called Leading with Questions by Dr. Michael Morquart. Mike has now become a friend, but he was a professor at George Washington University. And reading his book back in 2006, it was a page turner. And for me, it provided a new paradigm of leadership. And by the time I'd finished that book, I'd not only seen a new paradigm, but I realized that a leader who leads with questions will often be 10 times more effective than a leader who only leads by telling. So, Ken, that's my confession.
Well, I think a lot of us fit into that club like you were talking about. It's so easy that, we think we have to tell people a lot of times. And, one of the most interesting aspects of Jesus's leadership is he really did lead with questions. And one of your books referenced that, all the questions that Jesus specifically asked. But we'll get to that in just a second. But I loved your comment, and I've read it before and I heard you say it, that a leader who leads with questions can be 10 times more effective. Can you tell us how you came to that awareness and what does it look like to be 10 times more effective?
Well, Ken, I'll start with asking you a silly question, but I'm going somewhere with this.
Sure.
If you were in a boat with all your staff and there were oars for everyone, and your goal was to get across the lake as quick as possible, how many of them would you like to have row with you?
Every one of them.
Exactly. I told you it was a silly question, but it's a setup question for the next question. Why then, as a leader, would you want to sit at your conference table with all your staff present and you're trying to figure out how to reach some goal, overcome some challenge? Why would you want to be the only one with the oar in the water? In other words, yes, the oars in the physical water are the muscles, but the brain power, why would you want to be the only one accessing the brain power? Why would you not want to ask the whole team, gang, what do you think we might do to reach this goal? Faster, quicker, overcome this hurdle, faster, quicker. Why would you not want to engage? Well, the leader who engages the whole team. Now, mind you, when you ask the team, hey team, what do you think we might do? You are not forced to use one of their answers. But invariably, you're going to hear things, you're going to think, oh my goodness, I'd not thought of that. Wow, that's a better idea than I had. And then, Ken, one more thing. Let's just imagine for a moment you're on my team. And I'm saying, hey, what might we do? And you answer and say, well, Bob, here's an idea. And I say, wow, Ken, that's fabulous. Would you lead us in that effort?
Mm.
Tell me how that would make you feel first, and then tell me how motivated you would be to execute on that idea.
Mm. Absolutely. I think obviously I would feel more valued as a team member because you're asking me my opinion and thought, even if you didn't accept it. And I would feel excited to lead that charge if you gave me that responsibility. So absolutely.
And it's right in that ballpark of what I'm talking, and it's kind of a simple concept. When you engage 10 of them in what we might do, you're multiplying effectiveness times 10.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you go with some of their ideas, we've heard involvement breeds commitment. And when people share their ideas and you say, wow, great idea.
Mm-hmm.
Ken, would you execute on that for us? Well, now you got skin in the game. And whereas if I said, well, Ken, here's what we're going to do, and it's my idea, and you're thinking, Tiede, that's kind of a dumb idea, but you're the boss paying my salary. Well, you execute, but not with your whole heart, not like when we go with your idea. So my concept of how leading with questions makes you more effective is really simple. You get better ideas, you get ownership, you get involvement, and you get to cheer them on as they lead forward with one of their fabulous ideas.
Now, one of the questions that I did receive when people heard that you were going to be joining me on this conversation is that, and I agree with you, and I'm 100% bought into the example that you just talked about. But there are times that, and the question that I received specifically was, what happens when a team member when you ask for a question and the team member gets discouraged that you don't take their idea? How do you still encourage involvement, but communicate that you're not really necessarily going to follow an idea that somebody has given to you? How do you communicate that or build that into your culture?
That's a fabulous question. And, in the public chat, I'd welcome anyone to answer that. It's not like Bob knows all the right answers. I have a thought, but again, this is not, Harvard Business School professor says.
Don't tell them that, Bob.
But here's something interesting. Joel Manby, who was the CEO of SeaWorld, in his book, Love Works, he shares the story of a guy he hired in his previous role when he was Hershine Entertainment. They have like Dollywood and Silver Dollar City. And he had this guy apply for one of the leadership positions. Truth of the matter was he was overqualified. He was coming from a larger company, and he'd have to move his family halfway across the country and take a pay cut. And so over dinner, Joel says, hey, we're making you the offer, but I have to ask, why would you do this? And he said the guy got tears in his eyes. He said, well, they, meaning his former boss, made a decision to lay off, I think it was like 1/3 of his workforce that reported to him. And he said with tears in his eyes, and they didn't even ask me what I thought.
Wow.
He wasn't saying, and I didn't get to make the decision. It was that they didn't even ask me what I thought. And so he was leaving because he'd lost trust in his leadership. And here's research shows something interesting, and that is when we ask people for input prior to making a decision, and we're genuine about it, it's not a manipulation. Our people can tell if we're trying to manipulate them. But if we ask for input prior to making a decision, we actually can make a decision opposite of their input, and they will still support it because they felt respected and being asked prior to the decision.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that answers the specific question, asked. I'm sure there, all of this is, what do we call it, an art and not an exact science. Knowing your people, um, listening to them, seeing what part of what they shared might be incorporated. Um, another principle I use, Ken, is if people can see their fingerprints on it, they'll support it.
Yep.
Now, sometimes those fingerprints, and again, I don't mean you do this in a manipulative kind of way, but sometimes somebody says, I don't like this font on the proposal. I think this font would be better. I always go with the font they suggest because I know just them seeing the font has their fingerprints on it. And so there's times where you can think, okay, what are they saying? Again, out of genuineness, that actually does add value to where we're going. And so looking for that part, and of course, sometimes it's going to be substantial. It's not just a fingerprint, but think, how can we add their fingerprints to this?
Yeah, I love that. I think a couple other ideas that where it comes to answering that specific question is back to your boat analogy. I think that was pretty powerful. And if I tell my team up front, hey, there's 10 of you or 100 of you or whatever, and they know that I'm a leader that asks questions of everyone, that I say, hey, we can't follow everyone's idea. It's my job to try to discern the best idea out of the entire group, but I want everybody's involvement. Then they're not necessarily as offended, or they don't take it as personal if they know their idea was just one of the ideas or one of the questions that we've asked. And
Sure.
Then the other secret that I learned, it took me a long time to learn this, I banged my head against the wall, is a lot of times when I'd ask questions, I kind of took it as they're all equal. And sometimes when people ask me a question, I might make a statement of what I believe. But then I learned to put a little qualifier on the back end and say, well, how much do you believe in that answer? Or how much are you convicted by it, right? And because sometimes there was, and people ask me a question and they say, well, I'm giving you a 10 answer, right? A 0 out of 10. Man, I'm 100%. This is the right way that we should go, versus somebody else that might say, well, here's a possible answer, but it's probably like a 3 today. I need to address them separately, right? Because I need to say, well, if we have 3 or 10 answers, hey, these were the 10 answers that we got. These were people that really believe this, and let's move forward with one of these ideas. The 3 people, they were just throwing something at the wall. They were giving us the best idea that they had.
Yeah.
It wasn't necessarily something that they were deeply convicted in. So I think a couple of those qualifiers helped us to ask better questions and get better answers potentially. But I love it. Good job.
Well,
Ken, I like the fingerprint piece.
I just wrote down what you said. I'm going to be using it. I love that. How much do you believe in what you just shared?
Right.
Yeah, that's fabulous, because you're so right. There's times, well, it was just an idea, or there's other times where there's much more conviction.
That's right. Right. Well, you talk about, I love your book about Jesus, where Jesus asked questions, 339 questions that Jesus asked. How did you discover that? And tell us a little bit about that book specifically.
Well, thank you. Yes. Here's that book. What I like to point out many times is I'll tell people, you've already read it. And they're thinking, I've never seen it. What do you mean I've already read it? And I said, well, have you ever read the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John? And they many times say, well, sure. And I said, well, if you've read that, all I did is I went through in the NIV version, New International Version, and I pulled out the 339 questions Jesus asked. And I always point out, it's not authored by Bob. It was compiled by Bob. Right. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote it. But, when I'm speaking with all audiences, I'm a follower of Christ, but many times I'm speaking in audiences where not everyone is, and I'm not offended by that. But I'll share that, what can we learn from one of the world's greatest communicators? In my case, I actually believe the greatest, but even non-believers would agree that Jesus was one of the greatest. And when we look at Jesus just strictly to observe him as a communicator, we realize he focused on 2 things. He told great stories, and he asked great questions.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we would do well in our communication to follow that example, to tell great stories and ask great questions. And another just observation is, of course, I believe Jesus was God, but if he was, that meant he never asked a question that he didn't already know the answer. You know, as a leader, I ask a lot of questions because I don't know the answer. But he already did. So he must have had another motive. And I think it was that he understood that to really create change within people is they will change far more if they're answering the questions for themselves rather than being told what the answer is. And one of my favorite questions, there's so many, but Jesus, I think we're probably all familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan. What we might not be familiar with is that the Jewish people at that time hated the Samaritans. I mean, they would go around Samaria the long way from northern Israel to Jerusalem because they didn't want to walk through Samaria, even though that would have been shorter. So Jesus tells a story where the hero of the story is the Samaritan. But he ends that story not by saying, therefore, but instead he asks a question. And he says, so who was the good neighbor? And the Jewish person, it had to be difficult to answer, to say the hero of the story comes from a group that you hate. And the answer given, the Jewish person chose not to use the word Samaritan, but instead he said the one who showed mercy on him. But I can just imagine that was a powerful moment in the life of probably all the listeners, but in the life of that Jewish person who had to, in answering, acknowledge this hated group. A member of that was the hero. Far more powerful than if Jesus had ended with, therefore, the Samaritan was the good neighbor.
Boy, that's powerful. I'm right with you. I think that's so critical, is to think through. And I love the questions that you teach through your books for us as leaders to ask, because it really does inform us as leaders, but it also really engages the relationship, just like you're talking about. There's something that people discover on their own. You know, I teach, Bob, I think leaders will be determined by the questions they ask. And I challenge them to think about, even from a business perspective, to think about asking bigger questions. And as an example of that, you'll love this. I don't think I've ever shared this with you, but I said, you know, not that I'm a big Tesla fan or an Elon Musk fan, but I said, what question do you think Elon Musk is asking his team right now? Well, the question I think he's asking is, how do we get to Mars? Right? That's a pretty big question, right? And it's not even, in my opinion, it's really not even about an answer to that question. He knows that the next big discovery, I believe, will come through space travel. And he's wanting to figure out what that next big discovery is. So he asked the bigger question to get a bigger answer, right? Jeff Bezos is asking the question, how do we deliver packages within an hour of somebody ordering on Amazon? So these questions that we ask, I think, are so very critical, and they give such insight to us as leaders and to businesses. One of your favorite questions I know you've written about, that's much more on a personal level, but it's with your team, is that you ask what 2 or 3 events or 3 or 4 events really shape their life. Why do you ask that question of your team? What's the bigger reason that you're trying to accomplish?
Well, first, that question comes from Cheryl Batchelder, who was the CEO of Popeyes and is now the interim CEO of Pier 1 and wrote the book Dare to Serve. And in that book, she said, how well do you know your staff? Do you know the 3 to 4 questions that have most shaped their lives? Well, when I read that, it was like, wow. I mean, I have a hobby. I collect questions. I immediately collected that one. And I couldn't wait to find somebody to ask it. You know, when you find a great question, you immediately want to look for who could I ask this question of? Well, it just so happened that my colleague in Canada, who's the Associate Leadership Development Director for Crew in Canada, and I've known since 2007, and I've coached for the last 4 years, was the next person for me to come in contact with via Skype. And I said, Neil, I've just heard this fabulous new question. Can I ask it? Well, of course, Bob, ask anything. And because we've been friends since 2007, I didn't expect to learn anything new. I only expected to be fascinated with what of all the things I knew about Neil would he say were the 3 to 4 that have most shaped his life. But when I asked the question, I was not prepared for his answer. Neil said, well, Bob, have I ever shared with you that my birth father died when I was 9 months old? My mother later remarried, and the man who's really my stepfather is the man who, in my heart is my dad. But he said, I've been reminded many, many times, as recently as a couple months ago, that in the final weeks of my birth father's life, he knew he was dying. He was in a big bed at home, and every day he would ask to hold me. And while he held me, he would pray over me and ask that the Heavenly Father would be a father to this little boy. Mm. And Neil began to have tears, and I began to have tears. And Neil shared, Bob, I truly believe that it was God honoring the prayers of my birth father that brought me to Christ. He said, I really believe it was the prayers of my birth father is the reason that I'm in full-time Christian ministry. And I thought, wow, this one question and 5-10 minutes, a relationship that was already good went deeper. And I'm not wanting to tell you that every time I've asked that question, I've received such an emotional response, but every single time it's been fascinating. And it's a question that only takes a few minutes. And like I just got done with a webinar, and in the midst of that, we were on Zoom where they could put people in individual rooms, and we put people all in rooms and gave them 4 minutes each to answer that question to each other. Mm. And when they came back, I said, how many of you would say that you now know more about the person you just had this 8-minute conversation with than some friends that you've known for 20 years? Well, every hand went up. Yeah. Because I could see them like, we're seeing each other. And then I said, how could you find out from the people you've known for 20 years what the 3 or 4 events are in their life? And of course they said, I just have to ask. But Ken, another motivation with employees is, it was Patrick Lencioni in his book, 3 Signs of a Miserable Job, who shared one of those signs is to be unknown. Yeah. To work at a place where they may not even know your name, but they certainly don't know anything of your story. They don't know when you walk out the door of work and walk in the door of your home what you're encountering. They don't know if you have an elderly parent you're taking care for, if you've got a child that's struggling in school. They don't know any of that. And Cheryl's question, where a boss would ask, what are the 3 or 4 events that have most shaped your life, and then listen to their staff. Not only do they learn things, but I think at the end of that time, the staff member leaves the conversation thinking, I've got a great boss.
That's right.
I'm working in a great place. We actually care for people here.
Well, you find out so much about not only the individual, but really what I call the underbelly of that individual. And I believe, part of even CEO experience, I believe in the experiences that shape us, right? And so, if you look at Jesus and with his disciples, he had these experiences. If you'd ask Peter what were 1 or 2 defining moments in his life, I'm sure he would tell us the day that Jesus called him, or the day that he walked on water.
Yeah.
That would tell us a lot about who Peter was, right? So I think those questions are so profound. I think those are great interview questions too, when you think about onboarding somebody into an organization, right? Asking those questions early. Now, you state in your book that you can teach anybody how to lead with questions in 30 seconds. Can you tell us how do we add that skill to our leadership plate?
Well, I'm wondering, Tom Boyer, I see you there. Would you unmute?
I've been caught.
You've been caught. Tom, would you like to learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds?
I would like to.
Okay. I'm glad you said yes. I kind of picked Tom out from the pictures because I've never met Tom, but I just sense that Tom has a photographic memory.
Oh boy.
And Tom's only going to have to hear my 4 favorite questions once, and he'll have them memorized.
Okay.
But Tom, just hold a second. I often, when I'm talking and speaking on leading with questions, I get the impression from people that they'd like to learn to lead with questions, but they imagine that they'd kind of like need to go get a master's degree in questionology. It's kind of like, you know, a great idea, but, you know, it's not really realistic that I'm going to have the time to go learn about this.
Right.
And so I love sharing with people like Tom that, no, you don't have to go get a master's. You can actually learn to lead with questions in 30 seconds. So Tom, here we go.
Okay.
All you have to do is memorize my 4 favorite questions. I'm going to share them with you now.
Okay.
And I believe you'll instantly have them memorized, and then I'll ask you to share them with the group. The first question, what do you think? The second, what else? The third, what else? The fourth, what else? Tom, do you have them memorized?
Yes.
Let me hear them.
All right. What do you think? What else? What else? What else?
Yes. Now, some of you are looking just a little skeptical, like, Bob, you can't ask, what do you think? What else? What else? What else? Well, imagine a conversation now where I've asked Tom a question. Hey, Tom, what do you think we might do about, you know, this particular challenge? And Tom gives an answer. And I say, wow, what else, Tom? And Tom gives me a little more. And I could use a different variation of it. I can say, hey, Tom, I'm taking notes. Please say more. This is really good. And Tom continues. And I say, Tom, I mean, don't stop now. This is, give me all you got. And here's why this works. First of all, if you've been a leader who only leads by telling, it is actually this simple. In fact, your staff may be absolutely amazed that you've stopped to ask them what they think. But often when we ask just what do you think, the answer we get, and just put this through your own filter, somebody asks you, what do you think? We instinctively, again, without thinking, we'll roll out a first answer, a safe answer, and we see how is it treated. So if Tom asks me what I thought about something and I give him that first answer and Tom says, oh, Tiede, that's dumb. Everyone knows that. Well, he's not going to get another word from me. But when Tom says, wow, what else, Bob? Well, I'm a little more relaxed now. Tom likes my answer. And so I give him more. And he says, wow, I'm taking notes. Keep talking. Well, I'm beginning to think Tom thinks I'm one of the most brilliant colleagues he has. And so now I'm totally relaxed. And Tom is actually going to get my very best thought, generally the 3rd and 4th time you ask. But again, imagine it's a conversation and you're either asking what else, and again, it's the right inflection. It's not what else, you know, wow, what else? And, or can you say more about that? Or please keep talking. And some of the form of those variations. But thank you, Tom. And Ken, I think we've gone on longer, but just when I said, Tom, here's the 4 questions, it was less than 30 seconds and he had them.
He did. And Tom's not a quick study, so you did fantastic. I'm just teasing Tom.
Ken, can I share another story about that relates here?
Absolutely.
How many of you have stayed in a Marriott? I'm guessing all of us have stayed in a Marriott one time or another. And one of the founders is J.W. Marriott. Mm-hmm. And I guess it was about 2 years ago, Sherry and I were in Nashville and we were staying at the Opryland Hotel, that really big one, which is owned and managed by Marriott. And I had the opportunity to spend about 90 minutes with the general manager. And he was familiar with my books. And he said, Bob, do you know what Bill Marriott, that's short for JW, what Bill Marriott considers to be the 4 most important words in the English language? I said, I do not know. He said, well, can I share a story? And I said, well, I love stories. He said, well, when Bill Marriott was 22 years old, he was an ensign in the Navy. And he came home on a furlough. And lo and behold, his father had invited then President Eisenhower to be their guest on the family farm. I think it was in Maryland, not far from Washington, to go pheasant hunting on a Saturday morning. But it turned out that it was a cold, rainy, windy Saturday. And they're eating breakfast and they're kind of discussing what should we do. President Eisenhower stands up, walks over to the fireplace where Bill Marriott is standing, the 22-year-old ensign, and says, Bill, what do you think? And Bill later said, the four most important words in the English language is to ask people, what do you think? And he also shared, here was the then president, the former five-star general, the commander of the Allied forces on the Normandy invasion, who was not only managing and leading American troops, but had to interact with the British leaders, the French leaders, the Canadian leaders, and their generals. And he instantly saw the wisdom that Eisenhower could lead all those people because he was curious to just ask them, hey, what do you think? And he listened. And of course, I appreciated the story from my friend, the general manager, but I'll never forget that story of the four questions Bill Marriott considers to be the most important. And then there's a quote from David Thoreau, who said, the greatest compliment ever paid me was when one asked me what I thought and then listened to my answer, attended to my answer.
Yeah, I love that. That's I wrote that in the best ideas. What do you think? And really permeating that in our culture, I think, is really important. Now, I wrote in the book, well done. The two most powerful words in the English language are well done. but the four most important words, I like that. What do you think? Hey, I did get a question that was sent to me talking about your model, that 30-second model, which I think is profound, right? What do you think about this? And what else? And the question that I got, and I think it's an honest question, is how do you ask questions when you're tired? So you may get to what do you think, but you may not want to have that longer conversation because you're exhausted or you're tired. Is it okay to just ask the first question without asking the other questions? Or is there a time where you communicate that, hey, I really want to hear your answer, but I'm busy now or I'm tired? How do you respond in situations like that?
I guess for me, and I'm not a chess player, but I like the concept of thinking ahead a couple of moves. And there's times that I know I don't have time or energy for the full conversation that I would like here. So sometimes what I'll do is I'll say, Ken, I don't have time today for us to continue this conversation right now, but I'd like to leave you with a question. And when we get together next, I would love to hear your answer. And so I'll leave with a question. And what's really fascinating is most of the time when we get together again, they have an answer. In fact, if I don't bring up the question, many times they do. Bob, you remember you asked me this question. I've been thinking about it.
I love it.
Well, they at the same time do appreciate it when you say, hey, Ken, last time we're together, I left you with a question. I'm really curious if you've had time to give that some thought and go from there.
Yeah, actually, I found one of the another secrets to successful business meetings and even for our CEO retreats is I try to send out a question ahead of time because I want people to be thinking about that a day or two or a week before an actual sessions when we get together, just for that very purpose. So I love the idea of leaving with a question, Bob. That's fantastic. Hey, you are making your new book available for free on your website. Can you tell us how to get that new book for free and why would you offer that book for free?
Well, Ken, all my books are free as ebooks. And people can go to leadingwithquestions.com, and up on the top, they're going to see this, but just click there, or go to leadingwithquestions.com/resources. And you enter your email, and you'll be given access to not only the 3 books in English, these 2 are also available as a free audiobook. And then these 2 are also available in Spanish as both free ebooks and free audiobooks.
Outstanding.
I did not do the Spanish audiobook, but a wonderful woman in Chicago who's an on-air radio personality on one of the Chicago Spanish stations did it. And they're also available in French and Chinese, traditional and simplified. And they're all free. So people ask me, why do I make them free? And the simple answer is that I'm lazy. And here's what I mean by that. I'd have to figure out how to collect and turn in sales tax in multiple states. And then I'd have to figure out how much money did I make. Now, friends, if I thought I was leaving $100,000 on the table, I'd probably figure that out. But I consider my books just to kind of be my expensive business card. And it's a bit like that MasterCard commercial. I mean, yesterday I received a text message from a friend in Singapore. And he was thanking me for the Chinese translations and says, Bob, and I was unaware of this, like I hadn't heard from for a year. He said, Bob, we are using your 2 books in all of our leadership seminars. Thank you so much. They're making a difference. Well, hearing those stories to me is priceless and worth way more than a few dollars. And so everything I do, this is just how I've been led. I'm not suggesting that everybody ought to do what I do, but I've chosen not to monetize what I do on social media, but instead to make it available for free. Because personally, to me, the value that's priceless is hearing leaders share how much their leadership effectiveness has been improved. And then knowing also the second wave, how much their staff are benefiting. A quote I love is that when a leader gets better, everybody wins. So that's what motivates me to do it for free, Ken.
Well, I appreciate that. I really do. I've appreciated the books, and of course I have a couple signed copies, which I greatly appreciate. But you practice a second step principle with your books as well, because you recognize that a lot of people give away books to somebody else, and sometimes write a personal note in it. And you created a letter that people can request that goes along with the book when they give it away. Can you tell a little bit about that letter and how that works?
Well, thank you, Ken. Yes, honored to do that. I'll ask, how many of you have actually purchased a book and given it to a friend? Well, we all have. And then I ask this question, well, did your friend figure out the name and address of the author and write them a thank you, or did your friend thank you? Well, of course, they thanked you because you're the one who gave them the book. And so one of the things that excites me is I've created the opportunity whereby you can make available the free ebook of, now that's a great question. I've created an email that I'd be happy to send you that you can copy and paste and send, or copy, paste, and edit to personalize if you'd like, and to send out to everybody in the shadow of your influence, offering the opportunity to download the free ebook or audiobook as offering that to them. And what excites me is you're the one that's going to receive the thanks and appreciation from, your colleagues, your clients, your friends, that you're the one that connected them to that. So all it will cost you is a bit of your time. And then, again, you could enter your email in the public chat and I'd capture it and we'd send that email to you. but I've got another offer. Some of you wonder, well, how can I actually get the printed version? Because you just said they're not available for sale, only for friends. How do you get one? Well, here's the answer. If you'll promise to send that email to all those in the shadow of your influence, when I email you the letter, email me back saying, Bob, I'm sending it to everyone I know, and here's my address, and we will send you the printed version in appreciation for you sharing the opportunity to download the ebook. We'll send you this, again, absolutely free.
Wow, so that's quite an offer, Bob. I just shows your heart, your servant heart as a leader, and it's great thinking from a company perspective that any CEO could give that ebook to every one of their employees as a personal growth plan, which is a great thing to do at the moment when sometimes we're questioning so much that's happening in our world. To get a book like that, and then obviously you would send the hard copy or the
Yep.
physical book to the CEO or the owner, and as they shared that, and then obviously even spreading it out to other people. Well, I'm just so impressed with what you do in your servant heart as it relates.
Oh, my pleasure. Again, just if you would like that email, and you don't even need to make a final decision. You can say, well, let me send the email and I'll look at it and see if I want to send it. But if you'll put your email address in the public chat, we will get you that email that you can copy, paste, and send. And if you choose to send it, then say, Bob, I sent it. Here's my address, mailing address. Send me the real book. And I'll not only send it, I'll inscribe it to you.
Excellent, excellent. Hey, we've only got a few more, about 20 minutes left or 15 minutes left with Bob. So if you have a question, you can send it to me or put it in the chat box as well. You know, Bob, in our monthly executive retreat guide, we have what we call a question quadrant. And it's 4 questions that I say 4 questions that every leader should be asked and every leader should ask. And one of those questions is, what have you learned over the last 30 days? Where are you growing? Where's your mind being inspired, right? And another key question is, what's the most important project are you working on, right? Out of Ephesians 2:10, that we're God's workmanship. Another question that I ask is, what win do I need to celebrate? And what's the biggest breakthrough? Where do we give praise? And Thanksgiving, one of the questions that Jesus asked to the lepers when he healed those 10 lepers, only one came back and gave him thanks. And Jesus asked a really powerful question. He said, where are the other 9? Right? And boy, I think that's a pretty significant question for us to consider as we think about praise and worship. And then the last question of the 4 questions that I ask every month is, it's what I call a creative or innovative question. And the question is, what's changing in your world, or what has changed that you need to pay attention to? So those are some real critical questions. Can you share some other questions that you ask leaders, or that you think that we need to be asking ourselves at this particular point?
Well, Ken, your questions are incredible.
Thank you.
I've made note of those, and those are absolutely excellent. You know, for all of us, we need to know. There's nothing wrong with saying, "Hey, how are you?" But that's a greeting. It's not a real question, and I find just changing that question will allow us to go deeper. Now, sometimes you'd say, I don't have time to have a conversation with everybody in the morning that I pass in the hall. And so how are you is, can continue to be used. But, when you want to go beyond that, well, we have a chapter in here that is questions for leaders to ask other leaders. And I'm grabbing it now just because I don't always remember all those questions from the top of my head. And there's, 12 questions. And one of the questions I like to ask leaders, and Ken, you just gave me an answer to this, but I love to ask leaders, what are your favorite questions to ask those you lead?
Right.
Well, Ken just shared, and every time I ask that, I usually walk away the beneficiary. because I've just heard some great questions that I might not have known that I can add to my collection. Another question I love to ask leaders, and again, especially when you're encountering them for the first time. Obviously, this isn't a question you're going to keep asking because they're going to wonder what's wrong with you. But I love to ask leaders, how did you get your start? Because I find that leaders actually like answering that. And it's probably been a long time since somebody actually asked them that question. And so, you know, one thing that's true of a great question is that the person answering actually enjoys that you've asked them and enjoys the opportunity to answer. Another question I love to ask leaders is, what is your secret sauce? What would you say are like the 3 ingredients that have contributed to your success? It's kind of like, you know, these 3 things that I've continued to do, I think are the ingredients on how I've become successful. Those are always fascinating. Another question I love is, who's opened doors for you? Almost all of us, and it'd be fascinating, almost all of us can name that we are where we are now because somebody in the past opened a door for us. Or we can name a number of doors that were open to us. And it's the whole concept that leaders open doors. And so, you know, after I've asked that question, I'll say, well, who have you opened doors for?
Wow.
And, you know, that's powerful. I love to ask, what role does God play in your life and leadership? And hear that perspective. And again, if they say, well, I don't believe in God, I'll say, well, I respect that. And we'll go on. Another question, and I actually got this one, I wish I'd kept it a long time ago, probably just in an email blast. I got invited to a conference in San Francisco, and it named a bunch of names and said this group of, like, you know, Fortune 500 leaders were coming together, and they were going to be sharing what their greatest failure has been and what they learned from it. Well, I wish I'd have kept it because I can't find it again. But just that topic was like, wow, that's going to be real and authentic. And it was like, I'd love to go. Now, the timing didn't work out and the price tag was prohibitive, but I stole the question. And that is, you know, what has been your greatest failure and what did you learn from it? Now, I wouldn't start with that question as question 1, but it's a fascinating question. And another question is, you know, what do you think are the keys to developing the next generation of leaders? It's a bit like, you know, what do you think the keys are to developing the millennials into leaders? And then the final question that in my list is one that I've discovered is really powerful, and that is, what questions are you asking yourself lately? I find that when I ask that question, the conversations almost always go deep and they go there quickly.
Right.
Because invariably, well, another thing people will say is, well, I haven't said this to anyone, but I've been asking this. And it's kind of like you're the first person they've actually verbalized what's been going on up here, but hasn't come out here to anyone.
Right. Well, I think their list of questions are outstanding. We could take any one of those and begin to own it. And I think we would just 10x our leadership, just like you talked about, if we would just embrace one of those questions and really start to implement that. And I may make a challenge to everybody that's listening. If you'll commit to the next 30 days to asking that one question, to whoever, pick one, ask that question every day for the next 30 days. Find somebody new to ask that question to. I think it'll change your life and your leadership. And so I just want to challenge us to do that. You know, Pablo had a question. That last question you were talking about is, you know, one of the questions you ask leaders is, what are they asking themselves. And Pablo's question to you was, what should the question that leaders should be asking themselves? Is there a particular question that you would recommend?
I don't know that there is, because as I've asked that question, the answers are so varied. You know, I imagine there are some questions leaders ought to be asking, but when you ask, you know, what questions you've been asking yourself lately, it's more of a personal. Very seldom do I hear, well, I've been asking what the 3 major goals for my company should be, or I'm asking this or that. They usually are more personal in nature. They may be about leadership. They may be about what's in the future, but they very seldom are the standard kind of strategic leadership questions that all leaders also need to be asking.
Well, you know, I might piggyback. I agree with you. I mean, it is very personal, and I do like that open-ended question. I might challenge leaders, and one of the questions that I've had to ask myself, and I think it transcends, is, am I working to well done? Right? Am I doing what God wants me to do?
Sure.
Is my priorities right? Am I staying close to my purpose, fulfilling the calling that God has? And I find that question really gives a lot of clarity as I go forward. Hey, Bob, I know we've talked a little bit about faith today, and you know, obviously you are a great man of faith. That faith is critical to your leadership and to your life. And you know, I think we both share a passion for um, having other people experience what God has done in our lives and how He's shaped us and changed us. Can you talk a little bit about questions that maybe as we encounter people that are not of faith, that how we engage with them, or questions that we might ask that doesn't come across as judgmental, but it comes across as, you know, the loving aspect of wanting them to experience the same experience that we might have. Can you talk a little bit about evangelism, if you will, and some of
Sure.
those questions?
My friend Andrew Sobel says that questions build relationships. Telling creates resistance. And I find that if I'll start with questions, you know, Ken, I'd love to hear your story. And you let people share their story. And I'll often follow that up with, you know, Ken, wow, thank you. Ken, another question. What would you say are the 3 or 4 events that have most shaped your life? By the time they're done with that, I kind of know where they're at spiritually.
Yep.
I don't know everything about it. I don't know, you know, I'm not saying that I can make the judgment God could make, but often weaved into their story will be, if they're a person of faith, there'll be something about that in the 3 or 4 events. But I find as you ask and listen, and then there's another principle, I would say it works about 75% of the time. Ken, if you want somebody to ask you a question, what do you need to do to get them to ask you the question you want them to ask you?
That's a great question, right?
Well, Ken, if I say to you, hey, Ken, where'd you go on vacation this year? You'll probably share your answer, and then what will you ask me?
Where did you go?
Yeah. If I say, hey, Ken, where do you like to eat? Well, you'll give me an answer. And you say, well, Bob, where do you like to eat?
Right.
So 75% of the time, when I've asked them, tell me your story with 3, 4 events, they'll return the favor by saying, well, Bob, tell me your story.
Mm-hmm.
And that opens the door, because part of my story is how I came to faith in Christ my freshman year at the University of South Dakota, when fraternity guys from Iowa State who were involved with Campus Crusade for Christ, now called Cru, came to our fraternity house. And the first 3, well, we invited them to dinner. They invited us to the living room after dinner where they spoke. The first three shared how, as students at Iowa State, they'd placed their faith in Christ. I'd never heard anyone my age talk about having become a believer.
Mm.
And the fourth person shared the four spiritual laws. And at any rate, I can weave into my story. And as I'm weaving it in, you know, I'm reading their face. And as I get done, you know, I may share, you know, may I ask a personal question? Are you a person of faith? And we go from there. But at any rate, my first two questions could sound like they have nothing to do with spirituality, but what they have to do is we're building a personal relationship. And out of that personal relationship, then there may be the opportunity to go further in sharing how I came to Christ, how they might come to Christ, but it's done in a way that doesn't feel like, how do I get rid of this guy?
I agree. I totally agree. You know, one of the questions, just speaking about that, about evangelism, but really it's about understanding one another. And I look at it pretty simple. I think, you know, there are people that, you know, obviously are Christians or they're not Christians, right? And it's good for me to understand where everybody's at on the scale. So I talk about values a lot of the times. And even from a company perspective, if you're a company that has a well-done leader or values-driven organization, every company has a certain amount of culture that we're trying to communicate. And if we're Christians, a lot of times those values come out of our faith, right? Whether it's integrity or honesty or teamwork, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, simply asking the question about somebody to say, hey, what are the top 2 or 3 values that make you who you are, right? And I really want to know that, you know, if they had to boil it down to 2 or 3 values, whether it's a company or as individual, I'd like to know what that is. And then, you know, I might say something along like, just like you've talked about, I say, hey, some of the values for me is I believe every person is unique and individually made, right? And I can talk about a couple of the key values that I believe that we're stewards. We're going to give an answer at some point to I believe to God, right? And I can say, hey, have you ever experienced those values? Have you ever had a relationship with those values? And where have you experienced that? Just back to your question. And man, that'll tell me so much about a person, because if I start introducing them to what I call Bible values or biblical values, they'll either say, yeah, well, I've heard about it, but I didn't see it, right? Or no, I've never experienced some of those things, or no, I didn't know where it came from. Well, now all of a sudden it gives me a perspective of where that person is that not right or wrong, just in the perspective of a relationship, which we talked about, which is what questions do. So I believe that's a really critical to our building of our relationships. And that's what we're called to do as leaders. Bob, I've gotten lots of comments, people saying this has been so good. They reference, this has been a great interview. Can't wait to read your book. Some best ideas that people have taken away is leaving with questions, and you know, the series of questions, writing down a series of questions. We've got several people that's going to be requesting. I'll send you the email with their addresses, that the letter that you're going to be sending out. Hey, do you have one last question to leave us with today before we get off our interview together?
I do. It's a question I got, I guess 3 weeks ago from one of my colleagues. I'm guessing many of you are leading virtual teams. You never imagined yourself leading virtual teams because you were all together, but suddenly your team is remote and you're connecting, you know, via Zoom or some other thing. And I want you just for a moment to picture your staff like on a Zoom call, and you're seeing the various members, and you know, they're trying to get isolated somewhere in their house, away from the rest of the family or roommates. They might even have a card table in a walk-in closet, and that's where they can be by themselves. Well, the question my colleague asked is, when you walk out of the room you're in, you know, in your house, what are you walking into? When you walk out of the room you're in, what are you walking into? And what he was wanting to uncover, and they instantly understood, wow, his name is Mark. Mark cares about us. Mark understands that, yeah, we're here working. And yes, there's the crisis of the pandemic, but many of your staff are experiencing some other crisis. They may not be on the level of life and death, but there's an educational crisis. They're not homeschool parents, but suddenly they got 3 school-age kids that are, doing school online, and they're finding themselves to be the homeschool principal. Or maybe there's a financial crisis. Their spouse has lost their job or income. And, or maybe there's elderly parents that they have to care for. At any rate, Mark asking that question and then the team answering, it was like it had nothing to do with business on one hand, but on the other hand, it was like nothing had changed, and yet they felt like they walked out of the room with less weight on their shoulders, because having shared those other crises that they were experiencing and hearing that from the team also, they all walked out feeling like, wow, I'm part of a great team. We actually care for one another. We actually acknowledge that we have challenges beyond our working remotely challenge.
That's right.
So that's my favorite new question.
Well, that's a powerful one. What do you when you walk out of the room that you're in, what are you walking into? Boy, that's a great question. Hey, Bob, I appreciate our friendship. I appreciate your work. Bob Tiede, go to his website, Leading with Questions, and you can get those free resources. And Bob, I just appreciate you being here. I appreciate the books you've written. I look forward to future books as well in coming years. So I think you've got some more questions to ask. And thank you for reminding us of the value and the importance of questions today. We've really got a lot out of our time together.
Again, my friend Bill Durkin, I can see there, great to have Bill on, asked, will you send the recording out to, or a link to the recording to all those who've been on the call?
Yes, absolutely, we will. And we'll put it on our YouTube channel as well to see the other CEO conversations. We do have another conversation this coming Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Brad Chase, who was a former executive with Microsoft, is actually releasing a book in June. We have a pre-release copy of that book called Strategy First. And I do encourage you to register for that if you guys can. I think it'll be a great conversation with Brad focused on strategy. But we will send out the recording as well. Bob, thank you for being here very much today, and we will get you those emails as well. Look forward to seeing you all again soon.